You can own a house without owning what makes it worth living in. That was the first sentence the woman in the white golf cart said to me less than 20 minutes after the moving truck pulled away, and I remember every detail because the smell of fresh pine from the docks still mixed with the cool lake air while the last cardboard box sat unopened in my kitchen. My name is Ethan Walker, and I had waited nearly 15 years to buy a place like this. After spending most of my career designing reservoirs, marinas, and flood control projects across the Midwest, I wanted one thing money couldn't normally buy anymore: silence. The property sat on the north shore of Blackstone Lake, just outside a quiet town where mornings began with loons calling across the water instead of traffic horns. The house wasn't flashy. It was a weathered cedar home built in the early 1980s with wide windows facing the lake, an old boathouse that smelled faintly of cedar planks and lake water, and a long wooden dock stretching nearly 80 feet into crystal-clear water. It felt like the kind of place where families built memories instead of showing them off online. I had barely finished carrying my coffee onto the back deck when I heard electric golf carts humming down the gravel lane. One became two, then three. They stopped beside my driveway with synchronized precision like they had rehearsed the entrance. 6 people climbed out wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the neighborhood HOA logo. At the center stood a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and the confident smile of someone who had never expected anyone to question her authority. "I'm Linda Crawford," she announced before I could even introduce myself. "President of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association." She didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she pointed toward the water behind me. "We'll need access to your lake immediately." I almost laughed because I assumed she was joking. Nobody introduces themselves by demanding someone else's property. But nobody else laughed. The silence hanging over the dock felt heavier than the humid July air. Linda reached into a leather folder and pulled out several laminated maps covered in colorful lines and highlighted notes. "Our residents have used this lake for years," she explained with the calm confidence of someone reading established law. "Your previous owner understood that. We expect the same cooperation from you." Before I could answer, another board member walked straight past me toward my dock, carrying a bright aluminum sign that read Private HOA Marina Access. I watched him kneel beside one of my dock posts and reach for a cordless drill, as if the entire conversation had already been settled somewhere without me. The sharp whir of the drill echoed across the water, startling a pair of ducks into flight. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. The fresh varnish beneath my hand still felt smooth from recent maintenance, and the faint scent of lake algae drifted in with the breeze. Everything about this place had promised peace just hours earlier. Now complete strangers were treating my backyard like community property. Linda adjusted her sunglasses and smiled again. "You'll find it's much easier if everyone follows the neighborhood traditions," she said. I looked past her toward the lake where dozens of expensive boats floated beside immaculate wooden docks extending from neighboring properties. Something about their arrangement caught my engineer's eye immediately. I didn't say a word. I simply watched the shoreline, counted the docks one by one, and noticed a detail so small that nobody standing there seemed to realize it would eventually change everything. Most people see waterfront property and notice the view. I see elevations, survey markers, drainage paths, shoreline boundaries, and construction history because that was my job for almost 2 decades. Every dock, retaining wall, and boat lift tells a story if you know where to look. That habit had followed me through every state where I worked, from flood mitigation projects in Missouri to marina renovations along the Great Lakes. It was probably the reason I noticed details other people ignored. Buying this place had not been an emotional impulse. It had taken 11 months of inspections, title reviews, engineering reports, environmental assessments, and conversations with the elderly owner, Harold Benson, who had lived here for nearly 40 years. Harold was the kind of man whose handshake carried more weight than most contracts. His garage still smelled like cedar shavings and outboard motor oil, and every shelf held carefully labeled boxes of spare bolts, weathered tools, and handwritten maintenance notebooks dating back decades. During our final walk around the property, he rested one hand on the old dock railing and looked across the lake with a quiet smile. He told me the water had always attracted people who wanted something that did not belong to them, and that owning shoreline meant understanding more than where the grass stopped. At the time, I assumed he was talking about fishermen tying boats to private docks or vacationers wandering onto the wrong beach. I smiled, thanked him for the advice, and honestly believed those were the kinds of inconveniences he meant. Standing on the deck that afternoon, while Linda Crawford confidently explained what she expected from me, Harold's words suddenly sounded very different. I looked across Blackstone Lake again. The afternoon sunlight reflected off dozens of polished boats rocking gently against wooden docks that stretched into the water like perfectly spaced fingers. Every house looked immaculate. Fresh landscaping, stone walkways, matching mailboxes, expensive pontoon boats with polished chrome rails. It looked like the picture of an ideal American lakeside community. But something felt mathematically wrong. The spacing between several docks did not match the shoreline geometry. A few extended farther than local setback standards usually allowed. Others appeared to angle slightly toward deeper water instead of following the natural property lines. Most homeowners would never notice. Engineers notice patterns because patterns usually reveal history. Linda continued explaining community expectations while another board member casually measured one corner of my dock with a tape measure, as though they had already decided how my property would be managed. I stayed quiet. Silence often reveals more than arguments ever will. They interpreted my calm expression as uncertainty, maybe even intimidation. In reality, I was collecting information. I noticed which board members spoke first, which ones waited for Linda before answering simple questions, and which houses they glanced toward whenever they mentioned community traditions. Those tiny reactions mattered. Organizations built around authority usually reveal their structure long before anyone opens a rulebook. After nearly 20 minutes, Linda handed me a neatly printed welcome packet. The paper smelled fresh from the printer, and every page listed regulations about lake access, boat storage, guest privileges, seasonal maintenance fees, and shared dock responsibilities. One sentence caught my attention immediately. It referred to every dock on the eastern shoreline as community access infrastructure. I read it twice before folding the packet closed. Then I looked back across the water at the quiet line of docks disappearing into the afternoon sun. Something told me those words were going to become very expensive for someone, although I was beginning to suspect it would not be me. The next morning I woke before sunrise, partly because my internal clock had never adjusted after years of traveling from one construction site to another, and partly because something about the previous afternoon refused to leave my mind. The air smelled clean, carrying that mixture of freshwater and damp cedar that only exists near an old lake before the boats wake up. A thin layer of mist drifted across the surface while the first rays of sunlight painted the docks in soft shades of gold. It should have been peaceful. Instead, I heard engines. By 7 o'clock, pontoon boats were already gliding toward the eastern shoreline. Families waved at one another, children laughed, and fishermen prepared their gear as though it were any ordinary summer morning. What surprised me was not the activity. It was where every single boat stopped. One after another, they tied off to docks that lined the shoreline beyond my property. I counted carefully. 12 docks, 12 different homeowners. Yet every one of them eventually crossed the same narrow stretch of water beside my shoreline before. Reaching open lake, Linda had mentioned community traditions, but traditions usually grow from permission. These looked more like assumptions that had survived so long nobody questioned them anymore. Around mid-morning, I decided to introduce myself to a few neighbors. Most were polite, but strangely cautious. Conversations ended the moment the homeowners association came up. One retired couple complimented the house, then quietly changed the subject when I asked how long they had lived there. Another neighbor smiled nervously before glancing toward Linda's large brick home across the cove, as though even casual conversations required approval. It reminded me of small towns where everyone knows the rules, but nobody remembers who originally made them. By lunchtime, another golf cart stopped outside my driveway. This time it carried 2 maintenance volunteers wearing bright orange safety shirts with the association logo. They carried bundles of identical aluminum signs and a cordless impact driver. Without asking, they walked toward the shoreline and began discussing where new markers should be installed before the holiday weekend. One of them pointed directly at my dock while reading from a clipboard. The other nodded as though replacing my private signage with association notices was completely routine. I stepped outside before they unpacked a single tool. They smiled politely, and explained they were only updating lake navigation markers for community consistency. I asked who authorized modifications on private property. Their confidence disappeared for only a second before one of them answered with the same phrase Linda had used the day before. Community policy. That answer fascinated me more than it irritated me. When different people repeat identical wording without hesitation, it usually means they have been coached. I thanked them, declined the installation, and watched them drive away toward the next property. As their golf cart disappeared around the bend, I noticed something else. Every dock displayed the same small metal identification plate attached near the shoreline. Same size, same placement, same engraved numbering system. Uniformity like that rarely happens by accident. Someone had organized every structure years ago. Standing at the end of my dock, I listened to water gently tapping the weathered pilings beneath my feet while gulls circled overhead. The lake itself remained calm, almost indifferent to the arguments taking shape around it. I reached down and brushed my hand across one of the old cedar posts that Harold Benson had personally restored years earlier. Just beneath the fresh stain, hidden where nobody would casually look, I felt the edge of an older brass survey marker embedded in the wood. It was worn smooth with age, but it was still there, quietly waiting for someone who knew exactly why it had been installed. By the fourth day, it became obvious this was never about welcoming a new neighbor. It was about teaching one. Every morning brought another envelope tucked neatly beneath my front door. Some carried friendly reminders printed on expensive stationery. Others listed suggested compliance measures with carefully highlighted sections of the association handbook. None of them mentioned actual laws. Every page leaned on the same phrase, established community practice. I spread them across my kitchen table beside my property closing documents while the aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the open windows. The contrast was almost amusing. My paperwork was filled with legal descriptions, survey bearings, recorded easements, and county filing numbers. Theirs relied almost entirely on expectations. Around noon, I walked down to my dock intending to spend an hour organizing fishing gear, but another interruption arrived before I even opened the first storage compartment. Linda appeared with 3 board members and a smiling man wearing a polo shirt embroidered with the words Lake Operations Committee. He carried a clipboard thick with inspection forms. Linda greeted me as though we were longtime friends and explained they were conducting the annual shoreline compliance review ahead of the Independence Day boating season. Without waiting for permission, the committee member began writing notes while slowly circling my dock. He commented on cleat spacing, safety equipment, lighting fixtures, and guest capacity as though he were inspecting association property instead of privately owned waterfront. I listened without interrupting. Years of working with inspectors had taught me something valuable. The person who talks the most usually reveals exactly where they believe their authority begins and ends. Linda eventually unfolded another map, this one laminated and mounted on a rigid presentation board. Colored arrows showed boat traffic flowing neatly through the eastern shoreline. Every route converged near my section of the lake before spreading toward open water. She tapped the map with one polished fingernail. According to her, efficient community access depended on uninterrupted use of the shoreline. She spoke confidently about tradition, cooperation, and neighborhood harmony, carefully avoiding the word ownership every single time. Then came the sentence that explained everything. She smiled and said the previous owner never questioned the arrangement because he understood the greater good. Hearing Harold Benson described that way felt strangely wrong. During our conversations, he had struck me as independent, meticulous, and quietly stubborn. The idea that he had simply surrendered valuable property rights without documentation did not fit the man I had met. I politely asked whether there was a recorded agreement supporting the arrangement. Linda's smile held steady for a moment before tightening almost imperceptibly. She replied that not everything important needed to be written down. That answer lingered in my thoughts long after they left. Late that afternoon, I walked the shoreline with nothing more than a notebook and a tape measure, pretending to admire the scenery while quietly comparing dock locations with visible shoreline markers. The gentle splash of small waves against weathered pilings created a steady rhythm as I moved from one reference point to another. Several measurements confirmed what my instincts had already suspected. The docks looked orderly only from the water. From a survey perspective, they followed an entirely different logic. Someone had aligned them according to convenience instead of recorded boundaries. I closed my notebook, slipped it into my back pocket, and looked once more across the quiet lake. The people living here believed years of repetition had transformed permission into ownership. They had no idea that measurements, unlike memories, never change. The following week, the pressure became more organized. It was no longer just conversations beside the lake or unexpected visits from board members. Certified letters began arriving every other day, each one carefully worded to sound official without actually citing any county ordinance or state regulation. One notice informed me that my dock failed to comply with community appearance standards. Another claimed my shoreline landscaping disrupted the visual continuity of the neighborhood. A third suggested I would soon be responsible for annual maintenance fees covering shared waterfront infrastructure that I had never agreed to join. The thick envelopes carried the faint smell of fresh printer ink every time I opened them, and each signature at the bottom belonged to Linda Crawford. Instead of responding immediately, I drove into town and stopped at the county recorder's office. The building was small, quiet, and pleasantly cool after the humid summer air outside. The woman behind the records counter smiled politely when I requested historical plats for Blackstone Lake. She disappeared into the archive room and returned pushing a rolling cart stacked with oversized map books, yellowed survey folders, and decades of recorded property documents. I spent nearly 4 hours comparing shoreline revisions, subdivision filings, and recorded easements. Every page carried tiny clues. Some property lines had been updated. Others had never changed at all. What interested me most was not what appeared on the maps, but what never appeared. There was no recorded agreement transferring shoreline rights. No permanent community dock easement. No filed declaration granting the association authority over private waterfront structures. By late afternoon, my notebook contained more questions than answers, but one pattern kept repeating itself. The oldest surveys consistently measured from the same shoreline reference monuments that modern association maps ignored completely. Driving home with the windows down, I could smell fresh-cut grass drifting across the road as the lake came back into view. Everything looked peaceful from a distance. Boats floated quietly. Families relaxed on their decks. Children skipped stones near the shore. Yet beneath that postcard image sat a growing disagreement built almost entirely on assumptions. The next morning, another surprise was waiting. Bright orange ribbon had been tied around one corner of my dock, and a laminated inspection tag hung from the handrail identifying it as scheduled for community compliance review. I removed the tag carefully without damaging it and slipped it into my document folder. The wording fascinated me because it referred to my dock as association shoreline infrastructure. Whoever drafted these notices believed repeating the same description often enough would eventually make it true. Later that afternoon, I met an elderly neighbor named Walter while checking my mailbox. He had lived near the lake since before the subdivision existed, and unlike everyone else, he did not lower his voice when Linda's name came up. He studied the inspection tag in my hand, let out a quiet chuckle, and said something that immediately caught my attention. He told me the old owners used to keep every original survey marker because one man believed those brass monuments would someday matter more than the houses themselves. Then Walter pointed toward the far end of my shoreline, where an aging cedar piling leaned slightly toward the water. He smiled, tipped his hat, and said, "If Harold left you everything, he probably left you more than a house." I looked across the lake again, feeling the evening breeze ripple across the surface, and for the first time since moving in, I realized the real story might still be buried exactly where nobody else had bothered to look. Walter's words stayed with me all night. Long after the lake grew quiet and the last navigation lights disappeared across the water, I found myself standing inside Harold Benson's old workshop with a flashlight and a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The room still smelled of sawdust, machine, oil, and weathered cedar. Every cabinet was labeled in neat handwriting. Every drawer had been organized with the kind of patience that only comes from decades of maintaining one property. Harold had not been the type of man to throw important things away. If he believed those survey markers mattered, then he had probably preserved the evidence somewhere nearby. I started with the filing cabinets tucked beneath an old workbench. The first drawer held maintenance receipts. The second contained boating permits dating back almost 30 years. The third was filled with rolled engineering sketches tied together with faded cotton string. Beneath those sat a narrow metal lockbox wrapped inside a waterproof canvas sleeve. Inside were original shoreline surveys, correspondence with county engineers, and several folded plats that had never appeared in the recorder's public archive. The oldest survey immediately caught my attention because it showed every shoreline monument, every dock location, and every recorded property corner with extraordinary precision. More importantly, each dock was assigned an identification number that matched the small brass plates I had seen throughout the neighborhood. I carefully spread the map across Harold's workbench while the overhead light reflected off the yellowed drafting paper. Then I noticed something almost invisible along the bottom margin. A handwritten note referenced supplemental easement exhibits stored with the original waterfront subdivision filing. That single sentence sent me back to the county office the very next morning. The archives supervisor recognized me by then and quietly smiled as she disappeared into a restricted records room rarely used anymore. Nearly an hour later, she returned carrying an oversized storage tube covered in decades of dust. As we carefully unrolled the contents across a large viewing table, my pulse quickened. The supplemental exhibits had never been digitized because they predated the county's electronic record system. Every page bore official recording stamps, surveyor certifications, and notarized signatures. The diagrams showed exactly how access rights had originally been granted when the subdivision was built. What surprised me most was how limited those rights actually were. Temporary construction access, utility maintenance corridors, short-term shoreline staging during development. Every one of them carried expiration clauses tied to project completion dates decades earlier. None of them granted permanent community ownership over private docks. None transferred shoreline control. None authorized the homeowners association to manage structures located on individually deeded property. I copied every page, carefully organized them into protective folders, and drove home without saying a word to anyone. Back at the lake, I stood quietly on my dock as afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water. Families continued boating exactly as they had every summer before. Linda's association continued acting as though nothing could challenge its authority. Across the shoreline, those matching brass identification plates suddenly meant something entirely different. They were not symbols of association ownership at all. They were remnants of the original engineering survey that Harold had protected for decades. I finally understood why he had restored the old cedar piling instead of replacing it. Hidden inside it was not just a survey monument. It was the physical reference point connecting every official shoreline measurement on Blackstone Lake. And if my calculations were correct, every dock the association claimed as community infrastructure had been standing for years on property lines they had never actually controlled. I resisted the temptation to confront Linda immediately because experience had taught me that evidence becomes far more valuable when the other side has already committed to its version of the story. Instead, I spent the next several days quietly preparing. Before sunrise each morning, I walked the shoreline carrying nothing more suspicious than a fishing rod and a thermos of coffee. While everyone assumed I was enjoying the lake, I was documenting every visible reference point with photographs, measuring distances between shoreline monuments, and comparing them with Harold's original survey notes. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of fresh water and wild grass, while boat hulls gently knocked against wooden pilings across the cove. Every familiar sound made the neighborhood appear peaceful, but beneath that calm surface I was assembling a picture that became clearer with every measurement. I hired an independent licensed surveyor from 2 counties away, someone with no connection to Lakeview Shores and no interest in neighborhood politics. When I handed him Harold's original plats together with the supplemental county exhibits, his eyebrows lifted before he said a single word. 2 days later, he returned with modern GPS equipment, optical instruments, and historical control data. We worked quietly without attracting unnecessary attention. Every brass monument matched Harold's documentation within fractions of an inch despite the passing decades. The old cedar piling proved exactly what I had hoped. It remained the controlling shoreline reference used in the original subdivision survey. That single monument connected every legal measurement surrounding Blackstone Lake. As the survey progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Several docks extended across boundaries established by recorded deeds rather than community assumptions. Others relied entirely on access rights that had expired many years earlier. The surveyor never offered opinions. He simply documented facts with the calm precision that only licensed professionals possess. By Friday afternoon, he handed me a preliminary field report thick with certified measurements, coordinate tables, photographs, and references to county recording numbers. Holding that report felt very different from opening the association's welcome packet a week earlier. One relied on confidence. The other relied on evidence. Meanwhile, Linda appeared more certain than ever that I would eventually fall into line. Another invitation arrived requesting my attendance at the monthly Homeowners Association meeting where the Waterfront Committee planned to vote on permanent shoreline management standards. According to the agenda enclosed with the notice, they intended to formalize exclusive association authority over every dock serving the eastern shoreline. Reading those words, I could not help but smile. They were about to place their entire position into official meeting minutes, creating a written record built upon assumptions that the certified survey directly contradicted. I accepted the invitation without objection. During the days leading up to the meeting, I said nothing to my neighbors, nothing to the board, and nothing on community message boards where rumors traveled faster than facts. Instead, I organized every document into chronological order, placed each certified copy into labeled folders, and scheduled one final appointment with the county survey office to verify every reference before moving forward. Late that evening, I stood once again at the end of Harold's Dock. The setting sun painted the lake with deep shades of orange while rows of identical docks stretched across the shoreline exactly as they had on my first day. The only difference was that now I understood what they truly represented. They were not symbols of neighborhood unity. They were quiet pieces of evidence waiting for the right moment to speak for themselves. The Homeowners Association meeting filled the clubhouse long before sunset. The room smelled of fresh coffee, floor polish, and printed paper, while quiet conversations echoed beneath the steady hum of the ceiling fans. Framed photographs of fishing tournaments and neighborhood celebrations covered the walls, reinforcing the image of a peaceful lakeside community. Linda stood confidently at the front beside a large display board showing colorful maps of Blackstone Lake. She greeted residents with practiced warmth, thanked everyone for supporting community traditions, and opened the meeting by announcing the board's proposal to permanently recognize the Eastern Shoreline docks as official Homeowners Association waterfront infrastructure. Several neighbors nodded in agreement before the discussion had even begun. The secretary carefully recorded every statement into the meeting minutes while copies of the proposed resolution circulated through the room. I remained seated near the back, quietly listening as speaker after speaker described decades of uninterrupted community use. They spoke about holiday boat parades, fishing contests, family picnics, and shared memories that stretched back generations. Everything they described was genuine. None of it, however, established legal ownership. When Linda finally invited comments from the audience, I stood slowly and thanked everyone for allowing me to speak. I did not accuse anyone of dishonesty. I simply explained that before any permanent resolution should be adopted, the board deserved to review the complete historical record. The room became noticeably quieter as I placed 3 organized binders onto the front table. The first contained certified copies of the original subdivision surveys. The second held the supplemental easement exhibits retrieved from the county archive. The third contained the newly completed license survey comparing every recorded property line with the current dock locations. Linda accepted the binders with a polite smile that gradually faded as she turned the first few pages. The licensed surveyor, whom I had invited in advance, calmly explained his methodology, identified the original shoreline control monument preserved within Harold Benson's cedar piling, and demonstrated how every modern measurement tied directly back to the recorded subdivision reference points. A large projection screen displayed overlay maps showing the original legal boundaries superimposed over present shoreline improvements. Colored lines that had appeared orderly on the association's presentation suddenly shifted into a very different picture. Several docks extended beyond the assumptions reflected in the Homeowners Association materials, while the claimed management authority relied on temporary construction easements that had expired decades earlier according to recorded county documents. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The room simply grew still as residents quietly compared the official exhibits with the maps they had trusted for years. The county survey office representative, who had also agreed to attend after reviewing the documentation, confirmed that the recorded plats and certified measurements accurately reflected the legal shoreline references on file. She explained that any future questions regarding dock placement or access would need to follow the recorded property documents rather than informal historical practices. Linda slowly lowered the association map she had been holding since the beginning of the meeting. For the first time since I had arrived at Blackstone Lake, she had no prepared response. Around the room, I noticed neighbors studying one another with expressions of surprise rather than anger. They had not been trying to take something from me out of malice. Most had simply inherited a story repeated so often that it eventually sounded like fact. As the meeting adjourned, the evening sun reflected across the calm water outside the clubhouse windows, illuminating the same line of wooden docks that had first caught my attention. Only now everyone in the room understood they were looking at them through the lens of evidence instead of assumption. The weeks that followed felt very different from my first days at Blackstone Lake. The county survey office completed its final review. The Homeowners Association quietly withdrew the proposed shoreline resolution, and the inspection notices that had filled my mailbox stopped arriving altogether. The air around the lake somehow seemed lighter. Early one Saturday morning, I stepped onto the dock with a mug of coffee in my hand as the first sunlight reflected across the water, turning the surface into rippling sheets of gold. The same wooden planks beneath my boots creaked softly with every step. The same cedar scent drifted from Harold Benson's old boathouse, and the same gentle waves tapped against the pilings. Nothing about the lake itself had changed. Only the way people understood it had. A few days later, Linda knocked on my front door by herself. There were no board members standing behind her, no folders tucked beneath her arm, and no carefully rehearsed presentation. She simply acknowledged that the association had relied on assumptions carried forward for many years without ever comparing them to the original recorded documents. It was not a dramatic apology, and I did not expect one. Communities sometimes inherit stories the same way they inherit traditions. Over time, people stop asking where those stories began. I thanked her for taking the time to come over, wished her a good afternoon, and that was the end of the conversation. Soon afterward, the association invited every waterfront homeowner to participate in a voluntary shoreline review so future maintenance responsibilities could match the actual recorded property boundaries. Surveyors worked alongside homeowners instead of against them. Updated maps replaced outdated sketches, and every dock owner finally understood exactly where their rights began and ended. More than once, neighbors walked down to my dock carrying homemade pie, fresh vegetables from backyard gardens, or simply a handshake. Walter stopped by one evening and smiled as he looked toward the old cedar piling that Harold had preserved all those years. He quietly said Harold would have been pleased to know someone finally paid attention to the details. I think he was right. Looking back now, I realized the most important discovery was never the surveys, the easement exhibits, or even the legal boundaries themselves. It was the reminder that facts do not become less true simply because they have been ignored for a long time. A carefully recorded deed still matters decades later. A forgotten brass survey monument still marks the same point it always did. Quiet evidence waits patiently while opinions come and go. Sometimes the strongest response is not raising your voice, but opening the right file at the right moment. Every evening, I still walk to the end of the dock before the sun disappears behind the trees. I watch boats glide peacefully across the lake, hear children laughing from distant shorelines, and feel the same breeze that greeted me on the day I arrived. The docks remain exactly where they always stood, but now everyone understands why they stand there. Harold's final lesson turned out to be far greater than protecting one piece of property. Real ownership is not measured by who speaks the loudest or who repeats a claim the longest. It is measured by responsibility, patience, and respect for the truth. The lake never belonged to the loudest voice. It simply waited for someone willing to read the map all the way to the end.